All right, everyone. So I've been running the Necromancer for the past few days after maxing out my rogue, and this build is absolutely crazy damage. Probably the highest damage I've ever seen in Diablo, period, so far. It's just got so much DPS. It's got decent survivability. Some of the necro problems still persist in this build, but this is going to be probably the best option to run if you're going with Necromancer. And as I'll show later on, and perhaps at the beginning of the video, this build basically kills the Uber Lilith boss in like 10 seconds, which is crazy. Now, for those of you that are wanting to follow a sort of physical copy or virtual copy, there's going to be a link to this build in the description down below. Let's talk about some of the skills here. First off, we have Bone Splinters. This is very, very key because we're running a bone build, and this is going to allow us to generate some additional essence and just deal decent damage when you're casting your basic. Bone Spear, this is the core skill, literally and figuratively, of this build, and allows us to go ahead and do some massive damage. We're not going to go into Supernatural Bone Spear because we could actually have a lot more applications of vulnerable inside the build. We're going to be running with Paranormal Bone Spear to get us increased critical strike chance and dealing additional damage when we splinter through an enemy. We have a bunch of different passives here, which I'll go on a little bit later on. But the third skill is going to be Corpse Explosion. This is really, really important to actually give us a little bit of extra damage and essence regeneration with some passives. We have Blood Mist, which is basically the only real amazing survivability aspect of the Necromancer, which is why we're running it. This is going to allow us to break CC and kind of be like an oh dang, oh crap button inside the game. We have the last skill or last couple skills here. We have Corpse Tendrils. This is very, very important to actually go ahead and apply vulnerable if you wish, but actually I have run blighted corpse tendrils to drop blood orbs to allow us to fortify quicker. I found that I don't necessarily need to apply vulnerable as often, but you could kind of swap this one in between however you like it, depending on whether or not you need to keep up that vulnerable aspect. But this allows us to pull everyone together and works really well with our aspects later on. And lastly, we have Bone Storm. It's kind of a melee skill, but the main reason we're running it is because this is going to give us extra 20% crit chance when we're running Bone Storm or when we have it active. So it's going to absolutely nuke down bosses, and it's going to give us a little bit extra damage reduction, which is going to be pretty amazing. And lastly, we have Ossified Essence, which gives us extra 1% increased damage for each point of essence above 50 that we have. This is very, very important because this really is the key concept of this build, is to keep essence high. Now, we are sacrificing our minions, so we absolutely want to go ahead and take standalone for extra damage reduction. Running a lot of bone passives here for additional critical strike damage and some additional damage and critical strike chance. I put 1 point into Necrotic Carapace to get additional fortified chances. You can run this, especially if you are looking to kind of build up that fortify quicker with your blood orbs, which we'll talk about later on. Now, here's an interesting discussion between close damage and distant damage. Distant damage is generally going to be more applicable early to mid to early end game, and close damage is going to be more applicable as you get later and later on inside the game. Why is this? Well, we got to get close for Bone Storm, rather, our ultimate down here to actually proc additional damage, but also because we have to get inside the suppressors and kill them. And then, of course, we have a few different passives. As I said, Grim Harvest allows Corpse to generate additional damage for our Bone Spear and Essence. And lastly, we have Imperfectly Balanced and Unliving Energy to give us extra maximum Essence and core skill damage, and Queued Flesh to get us additional corpses around the map. Very, very awesome build. Let's dive into the aspects. Starting off here with the helmet, we're going to be running the unique Deathless Visage. This is going to give us extra critical strike damage with bone skills and some extra maximum essence, which is really, really nice as a stat. But really, we're using it for the effect, which allows us to give extra damage to our Bone Spear when we're going ahead and casting it. It's going to leave a little bit of a path behind. Chest piece here, Aspect of Disobedience. Everyone knows it. Everyone loves it. More armor, better. Gloves here, we have the Grasping Veins aspect. This is actually a Codex aspect, but gives us extra critical strike chance and when we go ahead and cast the Corpse Tendrils, which is when it's going to give us extra critical strike chance, we're going to get extra critical strike damage to the targets damaged by Corpse Tendrils. So as soon as we cast Corpse Tendrils, we're going to pull in everyone, and we're going to go ahead and get increased critical strike chance. This is an aspect that you absolutely want to go ahead and get 20% on if you possibly can. This is huge. Max roll of this is going to be a huge increase in DPS. Aspect of Might on the pants, because we're going to be running the basic skill and casting it quite often. Penitent Greaves is going to give us a Trail of Frost. It's going to chill enemies, give us extra movement speed. This is very, very important to actually allow us to kite a little bit and proc the chilled aspect in order for us to get the CC damage out with Bone Spear and also just deal extra damage against chilled enemies. Our weapon is going to have the splintering aspect, giving our Bone Spear applied vulnerable beyond the first target, and also deal extra damage to vulnerable enemies and pierce them, which is huge. Amulet here, we have the Serration aspect. It's on the amulet here because this is arguably our most important aspect. And I almost have a max roll of this, which is pretty crazy. But the Ossified Essence key passive, which we have, increases our critical strike damage of our bone skills by 1% per essence above 50 up to 60%. Basically, 60% extra critical strike damage. That is crazy, guys. That is absolutely insane for us to run, allowing us to get some massive DPS out on the battlefield. Okay, you can potentially swap this aspect over to the amulet, the aspect of Grasping Veins, if you have a higher roll, but I'm running Serration myself because I did not have a high roll of the Grasping Veins aspect. We have the Umbral aspect. This is going to give us extra crowd control resource generation. So whenever we cast Corpse Tendrils, we're going to get additional essence whenever we go ahead and crowd control someone. We also have the Exposed Flesh aspect. We have a lucky hit chance to generate essence when hitting vulnerable enemies with our bone skills. And lastly, we have the Accelerating aspect, giving us extra attack speed with our critical strike core skills, which are basically always going to be critical striking. Now, one thing I want to mention about the aspects here is that you might notice that I'm not running a two-hander, which might be like, why not? We have such good aspects, we want to double those up. And that's mainly because this offhand gives us cooldown reduction and critical strike chance, which is huge for the build, okay? So you want to run a focus simply for that reason. I definitely recommend running swords as well because critical strike damage is going to be pretty important. As for gems, topazes in the armor, emeralds in the weapons, and skulls in the jewelry. Skulls are going to be important for extra armor to stack with disobedience, but also topaz because we actually cannot avoid being CC'd a lot of the time. So the extra damage reduction while control impair is going to be super important. And then emeralds is pretty straightforward for extra critical strike damage to vulnerable enemies, which we're permanently going to have vulnerable up with all the different aspects, either with the grasping or the Corpse Tendrils pulling in and getting vulnerable, the splintering aspect is going to give us vulnerable past the first target, etc. As for stats, there's a couple really important stats here that you're going to want to pay attention to. And realistically, for your rings, you're going to want to look for critical strike damage and critical strike damage with bone skills and critical strike chance and maximum essence. Those all four are so important for the build. You're going to get so much more value if you can get all those stats, and that kind of logic applies to everything. So for example, your helmet here, you're going to get that maximum essence and cooldown reduction if you can't get your unique helm, which you're probably going to be running. Okay, so look for cooldown reduction, look for maximum essence. Your chest pieces and your pants, you're going to want to look for damage reduction in general and armor, things like that. For your gloves, you're going to want to look for critical strike chance and ranks of bone spear. For your weapons, you're going to really want to look for critical strike damage and critical strike damage with bone skills. For your sword, and then for your amulet, or your offhand, rather, not your amulet, you're going to want to look for resource generation, essence cost reduction, that's huge, cooldown reduction, and as I said, critical strike chance early on. And then for your amulet here, I like the ranks of passives and the ranks of corpse skills because it reduces the cooldown of Corpse Tendrils and gives you some extra value with corpse explosion. And then on top of that, I like cooldown reduction. And if you can get it, movement speed. Why? Because the Necromancer is crazy slow. That's not all the stats, but it's going to give you a general baseline overall for your build. If you can get them, you're going to be a lot stronger than you might think. We're going to talk about the Book of the Dead with the Necromancer. We're going to be sacrificing all of our minions with this build. The minions are okay. I find them to be pretty mediocre, so it's just better to kind of sacrifice them. You can see here with the sacrifice on Skirmisher, you're going to just get straight up 55% critical strike chance, which is a big bonus. For skeletal mages, I oftentimes will go with the cold sacrifice. You can go for the shadow sacrifice, which actually can be interesting if you want to increase your maximum essence. You don't have other roles, because maximum essence is actually a pretty big part of this build. But 15% extra vulnerable damage is pretty nice. I don't like the bone one. And then the golem sacrifice, gotta be the iron one. 30% increased critical strike damage is huge, right? You can go with the bone or blood. Blood's gonna be mainly for extra maximum life, or you can go with the increased attack speed. But generally speaking, critical strike damage is going to be your way to do massive DPS, so you want to sacrifice that iron golem. Now for the Paragon tree, I do not have the full Paragon, so I figured I'd show you the build that I actually have on the link down below. We're going to talk about the boards themselves, legendary nodes and glyphs. Not going through all of it, because, well, you can just follow along if you want to go ahead and check that out. Now, first off, for the first glyph, we're going to be running Blood Drinker. This gives us extra Fortify whenever we pick up a Blood Orb. Blood Orbs are pretty common, but if you want more Blood Orbs, you can oftentimes swap over Corpse Tendrils, as I said, depending on if you want more Blood Orbs. Fortifying is going to be huge in the end game when you start to really want to push and increase your damage reduction. And the second board here, we're going to be running a Bone Graft, and we're going to go for the Legendary Node Bone Graft, because we get extra damage and maximum essence increased when we hit with our bone skills, which is huge, right? Just straight up 7.5% increased damage and 22.5% or 22.5 maximum essence. And of course, we extra get additional critical strike chance and critical strike damage across the board. We're going to be running Sacrificial. It's going to give us extra 10% increased damage while we have no minions active. Next board is going to be the Flesh Eater one. We're going to be picking up Flesh Eater. Anytime we consume 5 corpses, we're going to grant 40% increased damage. It's going to be really nice against boss fights, particularly because we can consume the corpses and then go ahead and use our big burst skills, giving us just straight up 40% increased damage. But it's also going to work with our Corpse Tendrils and Corpse Explosion. Exploit's going to be our next glyph. Increased damage versus vulnerable targets and just ramping damage. This is going to be a very, very important glyph. Next board is going to be the Scent of Death. We're going to be picking up Scent of Death, giving us extra damage when we have no corpses nearby, and damage reduction when we do have corpses nearby. Pretty massive bonuses there. And Essence is going to be our next glyph, giving us core skills extra critical strike damage and doing extra critical strike damage, or damage when we critical strike rather, when we are fighting enemies that are not healthy, which is basically 80% of their HP. And lastly, we're going to be running Bloodbath and Territorial for additional damage reduction against close enemies, because we're going to be pretty close dealing with suppressors and hitting people with our Bone Storm, etc. So here we are in a tier 46 Nightmare Dungeon. I want to show you all kind of how this build performs. The DPS is crazy high, as I said. The survivability is pretty good. Keep in mind, I'm punching up insanely high at level 74. So I will potentially have some survivability issues in some parts. But most importantly, we do got to avoid some of those CC mechanics. And as I said, I'll be playing sort of a ranged caster because you don't want to really get too close. It's important to cycle through, group up your enemies with the Corpse Tendrils, and kind of burst them down with your Bone Spear. Also, make sure you weave in those basic attacks. It's very, very important that you do so. Otherwise, well, you're going to lose your Aspect of Might, and you might take a ton of damage. Also, it's important to note how Bone Spear actually works. If you cast it off, it'll just split at the end of its range, but if you hit a wall here, it'll instantly split, doing massive DPS. We also have to remember that we're getting extra damage when we're casting above a certain essence point, so you want to make sure you're keeping your essence high. And you can see here, I'm just clearing off some casual trash. I'm doing a couple 100,000 hits, pretty solid, but I'm not really using my Corpse Tendrils, which is going to give me a ton of extra critical strike damage until we reach some point with some sort of elite, right? So here we go, we found an elite. Okay, we're going to dodge a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and cast my Corpse Tendrils, group everyone up, and look at this. Just the straight up burst. It is crazy high. I basically 3-shot those elites, which is so good for a tier 46 as a level 74. these boss monsters, or these monsters, are level 100. And keep in mind, you kind of want to play with this style of using your corpse tendrils to kind of kite out your enemies and then just bursting them down in that big group. It's pretty simple, and this build has insane potential, as I'll show you all later on. But I'm going to skip ahead until we reach sort of the end of the dungeon, show you guys kind of what this looks like at a full clear. Just to give you all an example, this is kind of the potential you could see at level 100, consistently 1 to 5 million crit hits with Bone Spear. And I mean, look at that damage with the splinter back. If you kind of line up, that's kind of why I mentioned that if you hit the wall, instant splinters. If you're able to line it up, you one-shot basically everything. It is crazy. Now, I've seen some crazy things out there with the Sorcerer. I've seen some crazy things out there with the Barbarian. But by far, this build I've seen deal the most consistent high DPS out there so far. And that is absolutely insane. I mean, just look at this phase 2. I have tried on my rogue so much. I haven't put nearly as much time as some other people in there into the fight, but I've done like probably around 200 runs of the fight. And I have to deal with every single mechanic. I have to dodge the waves. I have to deal with the ghost floaties, whatever you want to call them, the boils, the everything. This build just ignores it. It just skips it. You don't have to deal with anything. You just one-shot the boss, which is so crazy. And this is kind of the goal here. I'm not quite sure if this is the exact same build because there's so many different variations of Bone Spear out there. But this is an example of Bone Spear just absolutely annihilating the Lilith fight. Again, there are still some problems with the Necromancer later on in the higher tier Nightmare dungeons. Like, for example, even the one that I showed you can be a little tricky for just high DPS and dealing, with all the survivability issues in CC. But overall, the DPS oftentimes will make up for that. I'll leave a link to this down below if you guys want to check it out, as well as a link to the build. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you all for the next one.